The rain had not ceased for 3 days, and on the evening of October 15th, 1814, it beat against the windows of the Dowager Countess Margaret Ashworth's bedchamber with a relentless persistence that seemed to Eleanor Whitmore like the very sound of time running out. The candles flickered in their silver holders, casting wavering shadows across the silk wallpaper and the pale, diminished figure lying beneath layers of embroidered coverlets. Eleanor sat in the chair she had occupied for most of the past fortnight, her plain brown dress neat despite the long hours, her gentle brown eyes fixed upon the face of the woman who had, against all reason and expectation, become her dearest friend. The dowager's hand, once so elegant in its gestures during afternoon teas and evening musicales, now lay thin and trembling upon the counterpane, the skin nearly translucent in the golden light. When those faded blue eyes opened and found Eleanor's face, something like peace softened the lines of pain that illness had carved there. "My dear girl," the dowager whispered, and Eleanor leaned closer, taking that fragile hand in both of her own. "You must promise me something." The words came slowly, each one costing effort that the dying woman could scarcely spare. "I know I have no right to ask it of you. I know what the world thinks of you, how they overlook you, how they dismiss you as plain and past your prime and of no consequence." Eleanor did not flinch at this recitation of society's verdict upon her person, for she had long ago accepted these truths as one accepts the color of the sky or the turning of the seasons. But the dowager's grip tightened with surprising strength. "They are fools, every one of them. I have watched you these 2 years, Eleanor. I have seen your kindness to those soldiers at your hospital, your patience with tedious company, your dignity when others would have crumbled. You are worth 10 of any diamond of the first water, and I need you to save my son." The name Frederick had rarely passed between them, for the estrangement between mother and son was a wound too raw for casual conversation. "He is destroying himself," the dowager continued, her voice breaking. "The gambling, the drinking, the bitterness that eats at his soul. He will not forgive me for remarrying after his father died, and now I shall die with that breach unhealed." Eleanor felt the weight of what was being asked settle upon her shoulders like a mantle she had not sought but could not refuse. The dowager pressed a sealed letter into her hands, the Ashworth crest bold in crimson wax. "Give this to him when the time is right, make him read it. And this." A pearl ring, luminous and perfect, joined the letter. "My mother's ring. Keep it as your token of this promise. Find him, Eleanor. See him as I know you can see people. Save him from himself." The rain continued its mournful percussion against the glass. Eleanor looked at the letter, at the ring, at the desperate hope in a dying mother's eyes. "I promise," she said, and Margaret Ashworth smiled for the last time. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning of April 3rd, 1815, broke over Bath with the gentle promise of spring. Sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the hospital ward, where Eleanor Whitmore moved among the 12 iron bedsteads, with the quiet efficiency that had become as natural to her as breathing. She still wore her grey mourning dress, the half-mourning she had adopted after the dowager's death, and found no reason to abandon, for who was there to notice what a plain widow of 32 wore? And what did it matter when there were bandages to change, and fevered brows to cool, and letters to write for soldiers whose hands had been shattered by French artillery? The daffodils had begun to bloom in the small garden beyond the ward windows, and Eleanor paused in her rounds to watch the yellow trumpets nodding in the breeze, thinking as she so often did of the sealed letter that lay hidden in her writing desk at home, the crimson wax of the Ashworth crest unbroken, the promise she had made to a dying woman still unfulfilled. She had tried, in those first weeks after the funeral, to discover where Frederick Ashworth had gone, but the Earl of Ravenscroft had vanished from society entirely, and Eleanor had told herself that she would find him when the time was right, when she knew what to say, when she had gathered the courage to approach a man she had never met with news he did not wish to hear. But 6 months had passed, and the letter remained undelivered, and the pearl ring hung on a chain beneath her bodice, resting against her heart like a weight of guilt she could not shed. The clatter of carriage wheels drew her attention to the street, and moments later Lady Harriet Sinclair swept into the ward in a cloud of expensive perfume and peacock blue silk, her eyes bright with the particular gleam that meant she carried gossip too delicious to contain. "My dearest Eleanor," Harriet declared, kissing her friend's cheek with theatrical affection, "you simply must stop hiding among your wounded soldiers and hear what everyone is saying about the Earl of Ravenscroft." Eleanor's heart contracted at the name, and she drew Harriet into the small office where Dr. Langdon kept his medicines, closing the door against curious ears. "He was seen at the gaming tables last night," Harriet continued. "Losing £500 he certainly does not have, and they say he has not been sober since Christmas. The Dowager's son, destroying himself exactly as his mother had feared, exactly as she had begged Eleanor to prevent." "Harriet," Eleanor said quietly, "I must tell you something I have never told anyone." And the story spilled from her like water from a cracked vessel. The deathbed promise, the letter, the ring, the 6 months of cowardice disguised as caution. When she finished, Harriet's expression had shifted from curiosity to something more serious. "Then you must act," she said simply, "before there is nothing left to save." Eleanor looked toward the window, where the spring flowers bloomed with indifferent beauty, and knew her friend was right. The time for waiting had passed. The assembly rooms on the evening of April 7th, 1815, blazed with the light of 300 candles in their crystal chandeliers, casting a golden glow upon the silk gowns and jeweled throats of Bath's most fashionable society, and Eleanor Whitmore stood near a pillar in her lavender silk dress, knowing even as she smoothed the fabric that the gown was 3 seasons out of fashion, and fooling no one into thinking her anything other than what she was, a plain widow of modest means who had no business attending such gatherings except that Harriet had insisted, had practically dragged her from the hospital with declarations that one could not save earls if one never left the sick room. Eleanor had not told Harriet the true reason she had agreed to come, that she had heard whispers the Earl of Ravenscroft himself might appear tonight, that this might be her chance to finally approach him and deliver the letter that burned against her conscience like a brand. She saw him before she was prepared, and the sight struck her with unexpected force. Frederick Ashworth stood near the card-room entrance, and he was nothing like the portrait that hung in the Dowager's sitting-room, that image of a proud young man with clear eyes and an arrogant tilt to his chin. This man was unshaven, his dark hair disheveled despite obvious attempts to tame it, his cravat tied carelessly, his blue eyes bloodshot and bitter as he raised a glass of whisky to his lips with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had already drunk too much and intended to drink more. A man stood slightly behind him, watching with barely concealed distress, and Eleanor recognized from description the Earl's steward, Thomas Greville, his face a map of worry and helpless loyalty. "Poor creature," a voice drawled nearby, and Eleanor turned to find Lady Beatrice Montague holding court with a cluster of eager listeners, her peacock feather headpiece bobbing as she gestured toward Eleanor with her fan, still wearing that dreadful lavender as if anyone might notice whether she mourns or not. "I declare, it is almost cruel to let her continue hoping some gentleman might look her way. She is 32 if she is a day, plain as porridge, and her only prospect died of old age before he could give her children. The laughter that followed cut like broken glass, but Eleanor had long practice in absorbing such wounds without flinching. Lady Beatrice's attention shifted to the Earl. "And speaking of hopeless cases, look at Ravenscroft making a spectacle of himself. His poor mother must be spinning in her grave. They say he has lost his entire fortune at the tables, and his own steward cannot control him. What a waste of a title." Eleanor watched Frederick drain his glass and signal for another, watched the way other guests edged away from him as if his disgrace might be contagious, watched Thomas Greville's hands clench at his sides in impotent frustration. The Dowager's voice echoed in her memory. Save him from himself. Tomorrow, Eleanor decided, her heart pounding with terrified resolve. Tomorrow she would go to him directly, society be damned, and deliver his mother's final words. The morning of April 8th, 1815, dawned grey and threatening over Bath, the clouds hanging low and heavy with the promise of rain. As Eleanor Whitmore stood before the tall townhouse on Pulteney Street, her plain brown pelisse buttoned to her throat, and the sealed letter pressed against her racing heart beneath the worn wool. She had not slept, had spent the night pacing her small bedchamber while Clara watched with worried eyes, rehearsing words that scattered like startled birds every time she tried to arrange them into something coherent, something that might reach a man drowning in whisky and grief, and make him listen to a woman he had never met and had no reason to heed. The butler who answered her knock regarded her with the particular disdain reserved for visitors who arrived without appointment or apparent consequence, his gaze travelling over her modest dress and finding nothing that warranted courtesy. "I wish to see the Earl of Ravenscroft," Eleanor said, and was proud that her voice did not tremble. "His lordship is not receiving visitors," the butler began, but Eleanor had spent 6 months failing in her promise to a dying woman, and she would not be turned away by a servant's dismissal. "Tell him that Mrs. Whitmore is here regarding his mother," she said, and watched something flicker in the man's eyes before he stepped aside with obvious reluctance. The study into which she was shown reeked of stale whisky and unwashed despair. Empty bottles lined along the desk like soldiers marking a slow defeat, and Frederick Ashworth sat slumped in a leather chair with his head in his hands, still wearing the rumpled evening clothes from the night before. When he looked up, his bloodshot blue eyes held nothing but hostility and the particular cruelty of a man who hated himself and found it easier to direct that hatred outward. "Whatever charity you have come to request, madam, I suggest you apply elsewhere," he said, his voice rough with drink and disuse. "I am not a generous man. I have not come for charity, my lord," Eleanor replied, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles ached. "I have come because your mother begged me to save you." The words landed like a blow, and she watched him flinch as if she had struck him across the face. His expression shifted from contempt to something raw and wounded before hardening into fury. "Get out!" he said, rising so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floorboards. "You know nothing of my mother, and I will not be lectured by some nobody widow who thinks she can trade on a dead woman's name." Eleanor drew the sealed letter from beneath her pelisse and placed it on his desk with hands that shook only slightly. "She was my friend," Eleanor said quietly. "She gave me this letter in October, the night she died, and made me promise to deliver it to you. She asked me to help you find your way back from whatever darkness had claimed you. I have failed her for 6 months because I was afraid, but I will not fail her any longer." She turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to add, "I knew your mother's heart, my lord. She loved you until her last breath, whatever you may believe." Then she left him standing among his empty bottles and his bitter pride, the sealed letter lying on his desk like an unexploded shell, and she did not allow herself to weep until she had reached the safety of her own parlour. The rain began to fall in earnest some time after the plain widow had left, drumming against the windows of the study on Pulteney Street with a relentless persistence that matched the pounding in Frederick Ashworth's temples, and he sat motionless in his chair for what might have been minutes or hours, staring at the sealed letter on his desk as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. The Ashworth crest pressed into the dark red wax caught the grey afternoon light, and he knew his mother's hand had placed that seal, knew her fingers had folded that paper and written whatever words waited inside, and the knowledge made his chest ache with a pain no amount of whisky had ever managed to drown. "Your mother begged me to save you." The widow's voice echoed in his skull, quiet and steady and utterly without judgment, and he hated her for it, hated the way she had looked at him with something that might have been compassion rather than the pity or contempt he had grown accustomed to receiving from everyone else in Bath. He reached for the letter with hands that trembled despite his efforts to steady them, and the wax cracked beneath his thumbnail with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent room. His mother's handwriting flowed across the page in the elegant script she had always taken such pride in, and the date at the top read October 14th, 1814, the day before she died, and Frederick felt something crack open in his chest as he began to read. "My dearest Frederick, I write this knowing I shall not see another sunrise, and knowing too that you will not come to me, no matter how many letters I send. I have made my peace with that, though it breaks what remains of my heart. You have not forgiven me for marrying again after your father's death, and perhaps you never shall, but I need you to understand that 10 years of loneliness nearly destroyed me. And Lord Ashworth offered companionship without demanding I forget your father's memory. I was wrong not to tell you sooner, wrong to let you discover my remarriage through gossip rather than my own lips, and for that I am sorry beyond words. But Frederick, my proud and stubborn son, you have let your anger consume you, and I have watched from afar as you threw away your fortune and your health and your future on cards and drink, punishing yourself for the sin of feeling abandoned by the only parent you had left. I cannot save you. I tried and I failed, and I will die with that failure weighing upon my soul. But there is someone who might succeed where I could not. Eleanor Whitmore has been my companion these past 2 years, and she is the finest person I have ever known, though the world sees only a plain widow of no consequence. She has a heart vast enough to encompass wounded soldiers and dying old women, and perhaps even bitter young earls who have forgotten how to hope. I have given her this letter and made her promise to find you, to reach you somehow, and I have given her my pearl ring as a token of my faith in her. If you are reading these words, she has kept her promise. Let her help you, Frederick. Let someone in before it is too late. The gambling debts are chains you have forged yourself, and they can be broken if you choose to live rather than merely exist. I love you. I have always loved you. Your mother, Margaret. The letter fell from his fingers, and Frederick doubled over in his chair, a sound tearing from his throat that was half sob and half howl, and the rain continued to fall as 6 months of whisky-soaked denial shattered against the rocks of his mother's final words. The afternoon of April the 10th, 1815, brought clearing skies to Bath for the first time in 2 days, pale sunlight breaking through the dissipating clouds as Eleanor moved between the beds of the hospital ward, checking bandages and offering words of comfort to the 12 wounded soldiers who had become her purpose and her solace in a world that offered her little else. She had not expected to see the Earl of Ravenscroft again, had assumed the letter delivered and her promise fulfilled and the matter closed, And so when she looked up from Private John Archer's healing shoulder wound to find Frederick Ashworth standing in the doorway of the ward, she felt her heart stutter in her chest with something between alarm and wonder. He was transformed, or perhaps transformed was too strong a word, but he was different in ways that made her breath catch despite her determination to remain unmoved. His jaw was clean-shaven, revealing the sharp angles of his face without the obscuring shadow of neglect, and his clothes were pressed and proper, his dark hair combed back from a forehead that no longer seemed furrowed with perpetual hostility. But it was his eyes that struck her most profoundly, those piercing blue eyes that had held only contempt when last they met, now carried something closer to uncertainty, even humility, as if the man who had ordered her from his study had been stripped of all his armor and left raw and uncertain in its absence. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice was steady but soft, lacking the rough edge of drink and disuse that had marked their previous encounter. "I have come to apologize." Eleanor set down the roll of bandages in her hands and smoothed her grey dress with fingers that trembled only slightly, aware that every soldier in the ward had turned curious eyes toward the tall nobleman standing awkwardly among their modest beds. Dr. Samuel Langdon emerged from the small office at the far end of the room, his eyebrows rising at the sight of the Earl of Ravenscroft in a charity hospital. But Eleanor shook her head slightly, and the physician retreated with tactful discretion. "My lord," Eleanor said carefully, "there is no need for apology. I intruded upon your grief without invitation. You delivered my mother's final words to me when I had given you no reason to show such kindness," Frederick replied, taking a step closer, "and I repaid that kindness with cruelty." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the ward, taking in the wounded men and the scrubbed floors and the vases of spring flowers Eleanor had placed on the windowsills to bring some brightness to the space. "My mother wrote of your work here," he continued, his voice quieter now. "She said you had a gift for making broken things whole again." I dismissed her words as the sentiment of a dying woman. I was wrong. Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks despite herself, unused to praise from anyone beyond these walls. "Your mother was generous in her assessment," she said. "I merely do what needs doing." Frederick's eyes met hers, and something passed between them that she could not name, something that made her pulse quicken against her will. "That, Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, "is precisely what makes you remarkable." He bowed then, formal and correct, and departed without another word. But Eleanor stood motionless long after his footsteps had faded, her capable hands pressed against her racing heart. Lady Harriet Sinclair's blue drawing-room had always been Eleanor's sanctuary from the indifferent world beyond its walls, a place where she could shed the armor of quiet dignity she wore in public and simply exist as herself. But on the morning of April 14th, 1815, she found herself wishing she had remained at the hospital among her wounded soldiers, rather than enduring her dearest friend's knowing smiles and pointed observations. Harriet sat across from her in a chair upholstered in pale silk that matched her dancing eyes, a cup of chocolate growing cold in her hands as she watched Eleanor with the expression of a cat who had discovered cream left unattended on the kitchen table. "3 times," Harriet said, drawing out the words with undisguised delight. "The Earl of Ravenscroft has visited your hospital 3 times in 4 days, and you expect me to believe this is merely about his mother's memory." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks despite her determination to remain composed, her own tea untouched on the small table between them. "He is grieving," she said carefully, "and he finds some comfort in seeing the work his mother admired." Nothing more. Harriet laughed, a bright sound that seemed to fill every corner of the room. My darling Eleanor, the man has not shown comfort in anything but whisky and cards for 6 months. And now suddenly he appears sober and shaven and positively attentive whenever you are near. Even you cannot be so blind." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to explain that a man like Frederick Ashworth would never look twice at a plain widow of 32 with no fortune and no beauty and no connections worth mentioning. But before she could speak, Harriet's butler appeared in the doorway with news that silenced them both. It seemed the Earl had called upon Private John Archer's family that very morning, the young soldier whose shoulder wound Eleanor had been tending when Frederick first appeared at the hospital, and he had paid off the entirety of the debts that had been crushing the Archer family since John's injury had left him unable to work. He asked only that they tell no one, the butler continued, clearly pleased to be the bearer of such gossip. But the mother was so overcome she told her neighbour, and now half of Bath knows. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, something warm and dangerous that she had not allowed herself to feel in years, and she thought of Frederick's blue eyes watching her work, of his voice calling her remarkable, of the way he had looked at the soldiers in their beds, as if truly seeing them for the first time. "He is changing," she whispered, more to herself than to Harriet. "Yes," her friend replied softly, "and we both know why." But even as hope flickered to life within her, Eleanor knew that Lady Beatrice Montague was at this very moment spreading poison through every drawing-room in Bath, calling Eleanor a desperate spinster chasing a title, and she feared the gossip would destroy whatever fragile thing was growing between them before it ever had a chance to bloom. The hospital garden at twilight on April 18, 1815, held a quality of light that Eleanor had always loved, that soft amber glow that transformed even the most ordinary things into something touched by grace, and she found herself lingering among the early roses long after her duties were complete, breathing in their delicate fragrance and watching the first stars begin to prick through the deepening blue of the evening sky. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him, and she knew without turning that it was Frederick, for she had somehow learned the particular rhythm of his walk over these past 8 days of his visits. The steady, measured pace of a man who had once been military in his bearing before grief and dissolution had temporarily stolen his discipline. He came to stand beside her near the rose bushes, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his soap and the faint hint of something warmer beneath, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply watching the light fade over the rooftops of Bath, as if by mutual agreement that some conversations required the gentle cover of approaching darkness. "She was there at the end," Frederick said finally, his voice low and rough with something that might have been unshed tears. "My mother. You were with her when she died." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with memory. "I was." She was not alone. "What was it like?" he asked, and she could hear the desperate hunger beneath the careful words. The need of a son who had squandered his final years with his mother and now could never get them back. Was she afraid? Eleanor turned to face him then, moved by the vulnerability she saw in those piercing blue eyes that had once seemed capable of nothing but cold judgment. "She was at peace," she said softly. "She spoke of you constantly in those final days, of the boy you had been, of the man she knew you could become. She loved you, my lord, with a ferocity that death itself could not diminish." Frederick closed his eyes, and she watched a muscle work in his jaw as he fought for composure. "I have not visited her grave," he admitted. "I cannot bring myself to stand before that stone and face what I have done." "You did not kill her," Eleanor said gently. "Your estrangement caused her pain, yes, but she understood your anger even as it broke her heart. She told me so herself. She said you had your father's pride and your father's capacity for love, and that one day you would find your way back to both." He opened his eyes and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her chest, and she was suddenly aware of how close they stood, of the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling evening air, of the way the dying light caught the silver threads at his temples and made them shine like something precious. "You speak of her as if you truly knew her," he said quietly. "I did," Eleanor replied. "She saw me when no one else did. She made me feel as if I mattered in a world that had long since decided I did not." "Then we are the same, Eleanor," Frederick said, and the sound of her Christian name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. He caught himself immediately, colour rising to his cheeks. "Forgive me, Mrs. Whitmore, I forgot myself." But Eleanor found she did not want his formality, not here in this garden where truth seemed possible. "Eleanor is acceptable," she whispered, and the first stars witnessed the moment when something unnamed but undeniable began to take root between them. The spring ball at the upper rooms on the evening of April 22nd, 1815, blazed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers and mirrored walls, and Eleanor stood near the edge of the dance floor in the rose-coloured gown that Harriet had insisted she wear, feeling as conspicuous as a sparrow who had somehow wandered into an aviary of peacocks, and finding herself unable to stop searching the crowd for a tall figure with dark hair touched by silver at the temples. She had not seen Frederick in 4 days, not since that twilight conversation in the garden when he had spoken her Christian name, and something had shifted between them like tectonic plates moving beneath the earth, and she had begun to wonder if she had imagined the warmth in his voice, the intensity of his gaze, the way he had looked at her as if she were something precious rather than something pitied. Harriet appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne and a knowing smile, but before she could speak, a voice cut through the music and chatter with the precision of a blade. And Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice as Lady Beatrice Montague's carrying tones reached her ears from a circle of matrons standing not 10 feet away. "Poor Mrs. Whitmore," Lady Beatrice was saying, her peacock feather headpiece bobbing with each exaggerated shake of her head. One almost feels sorry for her delusions, imagining that the Earl of Ravenscroft would ever look twice at a plain widow of 32 with no fortune and no beauty when there are so many fresh young ladies of good family eager for his attention. But I suppose when one has been invisible for so long, even common courtesy can be mistaken for something more. The laughter that followed was polite, but unmistakably cruel, and Eleanor felt the colour drain from her face as she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, wanting nothing more than to flee this glittering room and its glittering people, and return to the honest company of wounded soldiers who knew the true meaning of courage. But then she heard footsteps approaching, and she looked up to see Frederick, cutting through the crowd toward her, with the expression on his handsome face that she had never seen before, something fierce and protective and utterly determined. And he came to stand before her in his formal black evening clothes, ignoring Lady Beatrice entirely, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him like a wake behind a ship, and he bowed with a formality that silenced every conversation within earshot. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room, "I believe the next dance is a country set, and I would be honoured beyond measure if you would consent to be my partner." Eleanor's heart was pounding so violently she was certain he must hear it, but she placed her trembling hand in his steady one and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, and as they took their places among the other couples, she saw Lady Beatrice's face contort with fury and disbelief, and she understood that Frederick had just made a declaration that all of Bath society would be discussing for weeks to come. The morning of April 23rd, 1815, dawned bright with spring sunshine that streamed through the modest windows of Eleanor's small parlour on a quiet street in Bath. And she was sitting at her writing desk attending to correspondence when Clara appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained astonishment to announce that the Earl of Ravenscroft was calling and asking if Mrs. Whitmore was at home to receive him. Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest as she rose and smoothed the skirts of her simple grey morning dress, painfully aware that this room with its worn but clean furniture and its shelves overflowing with books was a far cry from the elegant drawing-rooms Frederick must be accustomed to. But there was no time to fret over appearances, and she nodded to Clara to show him in, steeling herself for whatever this unprecedented visit might bring. Frederick entered her parlour like a man stepping into a church, his eyes moving slowly over the modest furnishings, the faded curtains, the writing desk where his mother's letter had once been hidden, and Eleanor watched his face for any sign of judgment or disdain, but found only something that looked remarkably like reverence. "You live very simply," he said quietly, "for a woman who gives so much of herself to others." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she gestured for him to sit, and Clara bustled in with the tea service, and she was acutely aware of the chipped handle on the sugar bowl and the slight threadbare patch on the arm of the chair she offered him, but Frederick seemed to notice none of it, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her hands tremble as she poured. "I came to thank you," he said, "for what you did last evening, for enduring Lady Beatrice's cruelty with such grace when you had every right to flee." Eleanor shook her head, her voice soft as she replied that she had learned long ago that fleeing solves nothing, and that the opinions of small-minded people say far more about their own characters than about the objects of their scorn. Frederick leaned forward in his chair, and his next words seemed to cost him something, emerging rough and hesitant from his throat, as he asked the question that had clearly been burning in him since they first met. "Why did you make that promise to my mother?" he asked. "Why did you agree to save a man you had never met, a man who by all accounts was not worth saving?" Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gentle brown eyes distant with memory, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because your mother was the only person in my life who ever looked at me and saw someone worth knowing," she said. "The only one who did not see a plain widow past her prime or a woman of no consequence. And when she asked me to save her son, I could not refuse her anything, because she had given me the gift of feeling visible in a world that had decided I did not exist." Frederick rose from his chair and crossed the small space between them, and when he spoke, his voice was low and fierce, and filled with something that made Eleanor's breath catch and her heart begin to pound. "Then I owe my mother a debt I can never repay," he said, standing so close she could see the flecks of silver in his dark hair and the emotion burning in those blue eyes that had once seemed so cold. "Because I see you now, Eleanor. I see you as clearly as if you were the only person in all of Bath, in all of England, and I cannot imagine how I ever looked at the world without knowing you were in it." Clara watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes as the morning light wrapped around them like a benediction. The afternoon of April 28th, 1815, brought storm clouds gathering on the horizon like omens of despair, and Eleanor sat in Harriet's blue drawing-room with hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to her dearest friend attempt to explain away the inexplicable, while her heart crumbled to dust inside her chest. For Frederick had been gone for 4 days now, vanished to London without a word of farewell or explanation. And the rumours that had reached Bath were spreading through society like wildfire, whispers of the Earl of Ravenscroft being seen in the company of Miss Sophia Chalfont, a diamond of the first water at only 19 years old, beautiful and wealthy and everything that Eleanor was not and could never be. Harriet was saying something about misunderstandings and patience and the unreliability of gossip, but Eleanor could barely hear her over the roaring in her ears, the sound of her own foolish hopes shattering like glass dropped on marble, and she thought of how she had allowed herself to believe, how she had stood in her modest parlour just 5 days ago and heard Frederick say he saw her, how she had permitted her guarded heart to crack open and let light seep through after so many years of careful darkness. Lady Beatrice had made certain Eleanor heard every detail of the London reports, appearing at the hospital that very morning with false sympathy dripping from her painted lips, cooing about how the Earl had clearly come to his senses and remembered what was due to his position, how no one could truly have expected him to attach himself to a plain widow of no consequence when there were young heiresses eager for his attention and his title. The first drops of rain began to strike the windows as Eleanor rose from her chair, and Harriet reached for her hand, but Eleanor gently pulled away, her voice steady even as her soul was screaming. And she told her friend that she had always known better than to hope, that women like her were not meant for fairy tales and grand romances, that she had fulfilled her promise to the Dowager, and that must be enough. She walked home through the gathering storm, refusing Harriet's offer of a carriage, letting the cold rain soak through her grey dress and plaster her hair to her face. And when she reached her small parlour, she stood dripping on the worn carpet and stared at the chair where Frederick had sat, at the teacup he had held in his strong hands, at the writing desk where his mother's letter had once been hidden. With trembling fingers she reached beneath the collar of her dress and drew out the chain that held the Dowager's pearl ring, the token she had worn against her heart since that October night when Margaret Ashworth had made her promise to save a son who had now abandoned her without a backward glance, and she unclasped it and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, closing it away like closing a door on dreams she should never have permitted herself to dream. Clara found her mistress sitting in the dark hours later, and Eleanor's eyes were dry because she had learned long ago that tears changed nothing, that the world was not moved by the grief of invisible women, and she told Clara quietly that she was quite well, that she had simply been reminded of truths she had foolishly forgotten, that tomorrow she would return to the hospital and her soldiers and the useful, invisible life she had built from the wreckage of loneliness. The evening of May 2nd, 1815, settled over Bath with the gentle clarity that follows a storm, the air washed clean and fragrant with wet earth and blooming flowers. And Eleanor was sitting alone in her small parlour, with a book open in her lap that she had not read a single word of when Clara appeared in the doorway with wide eyes to announce that Mr. Thomas Greville, steward to the Earl of Ravenscroft, was asking to see her on a matter of urgent importance. Eleanor's heart, which she had spent 8 days carefully encasing in ice, gave a treacherous lurch at the mention of anything connected to Frederick, but she composed her features into the mask of pleasant neutrality she had perfected over years of invisibility, and nodded for Clara to show the man in, telling herself that whatever message he carried could not hurt her because she had already accepted the truth of her situation and made peace with her solitary fate. Thomas Greville entered with his hat in his hands and worry carved into every line of his weathered face, and before Eleanor could offer him a seat, he was speaking rapidly, the words tumbling out as if he had rehearsed them the entire journey from London and could not bear to hold them in a moment longer. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I have come against my master's wishes because he would never forgive himself if you did not know the truth, and I could not stand by and watch 2 good people be destroyed by misunderstanding and malicious gossip." Eleanor felt her carefully constructed walls begin to tremble as Thomas explained that Frederick had gone to London not to court Miss Sophia Chalfont, but to settle every gambling debt that had accumulated during his months of self-destruction. That he had sold the grand London townhouse his family had owned for 3 generations. That he had refused the heiress publicly and definitively when her father had made overtures about a match. "But why?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would he do all of this without a word to anyone?" Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a letter bearing Frederick's seal, and his voice was rough with emotion as he replied that his master had been too proud to court a woman while drowning in debt, too ashamed to ask her to share a life shadowed by his past mistakes, and too desperate to become worthy of her to waste a single day explaining his intentions. He told all of London society, Thomas continued, that he loved a widow in Bath, a woman of no great fortune or fashionable beauty, but of such extraordinary worth that he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve her. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the letter, and when she broke the seal and read Frederick's words confessing his love and begging her forgiveness for causing her even a moment of pain, the tears she had refused to shed for 8 days finally fell, not tears of grief, but of hope reborn, fragile and frightened but alive. And she pressed the letter to her heart as the fresh spring evening wrapped around her like a promise of tomorrow. The morning of May 3rd, 1815, dawned clear and new over Bath. The sky washed to a brilliant blue that seemed to promise fresh beginnings, and Eleanor stood in the hospital garden where the roses had burst into full glorious bloom since that twilight evening when she and Frederick had first spoken of his mother. The same garden, but transformed now by the fullness of spring and by the hope that beat frantically against her ribs as she waited for him to arrive. For Thomas Greville had sent word at first light that his master wished to meet her here at 10 o'clock, and she had come early because she could not bear to pace the confines of her small parlour a moment longer. And she had done something she had not permitted herself to do for 8 long days. She had opened the drawer of her writing desk and retrieved the dowager's pearl ring and clasped it around her neck, where it now hung visible against the bodice of her dove-grey dress. A declaration and a defiance, and perhaps a foolish gesture of faith in a man who had left her without a word and returned with a letter full of love. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him, and when she turned, Frederick was there, walking toward her through the morning light, with none of the proud coldness that had marked him when they first met, his face open and anxious and achingly hopeful, and he stopped 3 feet away from her as if afraid to come closer, as if he did not trust himself to be near her, or perhaps did not trust that she would allow it. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I am so desperately sorry for leaving without explanation, for causing you even a moment of doubt or pain, and I know that apologies are insufficient for the injury I inflicted through my silence. But I could not, Eleanor. I could not ask anything of you while I was still drowning in the wreckage of my own making." Eleanor felt her carefully reconstructed walls trembling as she looked at this man who had been so proud and so broken, and who stood before her now stripped of all pretense. And she asked the question that had burned in her heart since Thomas had revealed the truth. Worthy of what? Frederick, what did you need to become worthy of? He took 1 step closer, then another, until he stood near enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the fierce tenderness in his gaze that made her breath catch in her throat. And when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Worthy of asking you to be my wife, Eleanor. Worthy of offering you a future instead of a burden. Worthy of the extraordinary woman my mother saw when all of society was blind, the woman I see now with every fibre of my being. And I know I have no right to ask. I know you may have closed your heart against me forever, but I am asking none the less because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." The late morning sunlight of May 3rd, 1815, filtered through the leaves of the garden trees and dappled Frederick's face as he slowly, deliberately lowered himself to one knee on the gravel path before Eleanor, and she felt the world tilt around her, because this could not be happening. This proud earl, who had been so cold and so broken, could not be kneeling in the dirt of a hospital garden before a plain widow of 32 with no fortune and no beauty and nothing to recommend her except a promise made to a dying woman. And yet he was there, looking up at her with those piercing blue eyes that had once been so icy and were now blazing with warmth and hope, and something that looked terrifyingly like love. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice carried the weight of everything he had learned about himself in the past month, about pride and grief and the terrible cost of closing oneself off from love. "I know what the world sees when they look at you. I know they see a widow past her prime, a woman of modest means and unremarkable features. I know they whisper that you are plain and pitiful and past all hope of happiness, and I know that for years you believed them because no one told you otherwise except my mother, who saw what I was too blind to see until you stood in my study and spoke her name and shattered every wall I had built around my heart." He reached up and took her trembling hand in both of his, and she could feel the calluses on his palms from the riding he had done in his desperate journey to London and back, and she could see the tears gathering in his eyes as he continued. "They called you plain, but I call you the most beautiful soul I have ever known. They called you invisible, but you are the only person I see when I enter a room. They called you past your prime, but I believe our life together has not yet begun, and we have decades of joy ahead of us, if only you will consent to share them with me. And so, I am asking you, Eleanor Whitmore, to do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not because my mother wished it, not because society expects it, but because I love you with every broken piece of my heart that you have somehow made whole again." The tears were streaming down Eleanor's face now, tears she did not try to hide or wipe away, and she was aware that Dr. Samuel Langdon was watching from the hospital window with a smile spreading across his weathered face, and she was aware that the roses were blooming crimson and white around them like nature itself was celebrating, and she was aware that the pearl ring his mother had given her was warm against her throat, but mostly she was aware of Frederick kneeling before her with his heart in his hands, and she whispered the word, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." And he rose and slipped the pearl ring from its chain and placed it on her finger where it had always belonged, and then he gathered her into his arms in an embrace so tender and so fierce that Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be seen, to be known, to be loved, not despite her plainness, but because of the soul that shone through it, and she held him as tightly as he held her, while the spring sunlight blessed them both with its golden warmth and the promise of tomorrow. The afternoon of May 7th, 1815, found the upper rooms filled with the cream of Bath society gathered for their customary tea, and Eleanor stood at the entrance with Frederick's hand warm and steady at the small of her back, wearing the new green silk dress he had insisted on commissioning for her from the finest modiste in the city, a color that brought out the warmth of her brown eyes and made her feel, for perhaps the first time in her life, that she might be something other than plain, and on her finger the pearl ring gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, announcing to everyone present that the impossible had happened, that the proud Earl of Ravenscroft had chosen the overlooked widow whom society had long since dismissed as beneath notice. The whispers began the moment they crossed the threshold, a susurration of shock and speculation that rippled through the assembled guests like wind through wheat, and Eleanor felt her courage faltering until Frederick leaned close and murmured against her ear that she was magnificent and that they could face anything together, and she believed him because he had proven himself worthy of her trust in ways she had never imagined possible. Lady Harriet Sinclair rushed forward to greet them with undisguised delight, her smile so triumphant that Eleanor nearly laughed despite her nerves, and Harriet embraced her fiercely before stepping back to admire the ring with theatrical appreciation, while Thomas Greville stood nearby, looking prouder than Eleanor had ever seen him, as if his master's happiness reflected some great accomplishment of his own. The piece lasted perhaps 10 minutes before Lady Beatrice Montague swept toward them in a gown of garish yellow, her smile sharp as a blade, and she positioned herself close enough that her words would carry to the surrounding guests as she declared how touching it was that the Earl had found companionship with someone so suitable to his reduced circumstances, someone whose own lack of youth and beauty would ensure she had no grander expectations. A charity match, if ever there was one. The silence that followed was absolute, every eye fixed upon them, and Eleanor felt the familiar shame rising in her throat, the old voice whispering that Lady Beatrice was right, that she was foolish to imagine herself worthy of this man. But then Frederick stepped forward, and his voice cut through the room like ice as he addressed Lady Beatrice with cold precision, saying that he had spent 35 years surrounded by so-called beauties whose hearts were as empty as their conversations, and that in Eleanor he had found a woman whose soul shone so brightly that it illuminated every darkness within him, and that if Lady Beatrice could not recognize true beauty when it stood before her, then she was to be pitied for her blindness rather than condemned for her cruelty. The room seemed to hold its breath as Frederick turned his back on the stunned Lady Beatrice and lifted Eleanor's hand to his lips. And in that moment, the tide began to turn as other guests approached with congratulations that grew increasingly genuine, and Eleanor understood that Frederick had given her something more precious than any ring. He had given her the gift of being seen and valued before the very world that had always looked through her as if she were made of glass. The soft spring afternoon of May 15th, 1815, found Eleanor and Frederick standing together in the country churchyard at Ravenscroft Estate, where ancient oaks cast dappled shadows across weathered gravestones, and the distant silhouette of Ravenscroft Hall rose against the pale blue sky like a promise of the life they would soon share. And Eleanor held a bundle of wildflowers she had picked from the meadow during their walk from the carriage, purple violets and white wood anemones and delicate bluebells that trembled in the gentle breeze as Frederick stood frozen before the marble marker that bore his mother's name and the dates that bracketed her 58 years upon this earth. She watched his profile as he struggled to find words, saw the muscle working in his jaw and the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and she understood that this moment required her silence more than her comfort, that he needed to face this grief alone, even as she stood beside him ready to catch him if he fell. And so she waited while the birds sang their oblivious songs in the branches above, and the spring sun warmed the sacred ground beneath their feet. When Frederick finally spoke, his voice was rough with unshed tears as he addressed the cold stone, as if his mother could hear him, telling her that he was sorry for the years he had wasted in stubborn pride, sorry for the harsh words he could never take back, sorry for not being at her bedside when she drew her final breath, but most of all, thanking her for the gift she had given him, even in death, the gift of Eleanor, who had kept her promise and saved him from the darkness that had threatened to consume him entirely. He told the grave that he understood now what his mother had seen in the quiet widow with the gentle brown eyes, that he understood why her letter had spoken of Eleanor with such certainty and such hope, and that he would spend every day of his remaining years proving himself worthy of the faith she had placed in both of them. And Eleanor felt her own tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened to this proud man humble himself before the memory of the woman who had loved them both. When he fell silent, Eleanor stepped forward and knelt to place her wildflowers against the base of the gravestone, and she whispered her own words of gratitude to the Dowager, who had seen her worth when no one else had bothered to look. who had given her a purpose that had led to a love she had never dared to imagine. And when she rose, Frederick was gazing at her with such naked tenderness that her breath caught in her throat, and then he was cupping her face in his hands with infinite gentleness, and his lips met hers in a kiss that tasted of tears and healing and the beginning of forever. There in the quiet churchyard where his mother's spirit seemed to wrap around them both in blessing. And Eleanor knew that this was the moment the cold Earl completed his transformation into the man he was always meant to be. The evening of June 14th, 1815, wrapped Ravenscroft Hall in the soft golden light of a perfect summer sunset, as Eleanor stood at the window of the chamber that would tomorrow become her own, gazing out at the gardens where servants bustled with final preparations for the wedding breakfast, and lanterns were being strung through the ancient oaks like earth-bound stars, and she could scarcely believe that in 12 short hours she would stand in the chapel where generations of Ashworths had exchanged their vows and pledge herself to the man who had transformed from a bitter stranger into the keeper of her heart. And when Clara finished arranging her hair for dinner and left her alone with her thoughts, Eleanor allowed herself to trace the pearl ring on her finger and remember the dying woman who had set all of this in motion with nothing more than faith in a plain widow whom no one else had thought worth noticing. A soft knock at the door made her heart leap, and she opened it to find Frederick standing in the corridor with an expression of such tender impatience that she nearly laughed, for propriety demanded they spend this final night apart. Yet here he was, unable to stay away, and he whispered that he knew he should not be here, but that he needed to see her face once more before tomorrow, needed to assure himself that this miracle was real, and that she would not vanish like some beautiful dream before he could make her his wife. And Eleanor drew him into the shadowed alcove by the window, where they could speak without being observed by passing servants. He took her hands in his and told her that he had spent the afternoon walking the grounds, visiting every place where he had played as a child and grieved as a young man and despaired as a lost soul, and that in every corner of this estate he now saw not the ghosts of his failures, but the promise of the life they would build together, children who would run through these gardens, holidays filled with warmth instead of bitter silence, a home restored to what it should always have been. And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that she was giving him not just herself, but a future he had never dared to imagine, just as he was giving her the same gift in return. She confessed to him then that she was terrified, not of marriage or of him, but of waking to discover that she had dreamed this entire spring, that she was still the invisible widow everyone overlooked, that happiness of this magnitude could not possibly belong to someone like her. And Frederick cupped her face in his hands and told her with fierce certainty that she was the bravest woman he had ever known, that she had walked into his broken life when anyone else would have fled, that she had kept a promise to a dead woman and in doing so had resurrected a dead man, and that if she could be brave enough to save him, then she must be brave enough to let herself be loved. And when he kissed her forehead with exquisite gentleness and whispered that tomorrow she would be his countess, Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe completely in the joy that awaited them both. The morning of June 15th, 1815, dawned with such crystalline perfection that Eleanor could almost believe the heavens themselves had conspired to bless this day, and as Clara helped her into the ivory silk gown that had been commissioned from London and adorned with delicate seed pearls along the bodice, Eleanor gazed at her reflection in the mirror and saw not the plain widow that society had dismissed for so many years, but a woman transformed by love into something radiant. And when Harriet swept into the chamber with happy tears already streaming down her cheeks and declared that Eleanor was the most beautiful bride she had ever seen, Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe it, not because her features had changed, but because she understood at last that true beauty emanated from a soul that had learned to accept love after years of believing herself unworthy of it. The walk to the chapel felt like a dream. The ancient stone corridor of Ravenscroft Hall, lined with flowers that perfumed the air with sweetness as Eleanor moved toward the open doors, where sunlight streamed through stained glass windows and painted the floor in jeweled colors. And when she stepped across the threshold and saw Frederick waiting at the altar in his finest dark coat, with Thomas Greville standing proudly at his side, she felt her heart expand until it seemed too large for her chest, for his face held an expression of such wondering joy that all her lingering fears dissolved like morning mist before the sun. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sacred words and trembling voices, and when the vicar asked if Eleanor would take this man as her husband, her yes emerged strong and clear, and when Frederick slipped the gold band onto her finger beside his mother's pearl ring, his hands were steady, but his eyes glistened with unshed tears, and when he was given permission to kiss his bride, he cupped her face with infinite tenderness and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that sealed not just a marriage, but the completion of a promise made to a dying woman 8 months before. The wedding breakfast that followed brought together the small circle of those who had supported them through their unconventional courtship, Dr. Langdon raising a toast to the couple who had proven that healing came in many forms, Harriet laughing and crying by turns as she embraced her dearest friend, and even several of the soldiers from the hospital who had been well enough to attend, and who cheered for the widow who had tended them with such devoted care. And Eleanor looked around at these faces filled with genuine happiness, and understood that she had built a family not through birth or obligation, but through love, freely given and received. As the afternoon light slanted golden through the tall windows of the great hall, where generations of Ashworths had celebrated their unions, Frederick drew Eleanor away from their guests to a quiet alcove where a portrait of the Dowager Countess hung in a place of honor, and they stood together in silence before the painted image of the woman whose faith in them both had made this day possible. And Eleanor whispered a prayer of thanks to the friend who had seen her worth when no one else had bothered to look, and Frederick pressed a kiss to her temple and murmured that his mother would have been so happy. And Eleanor knew in her heart that somewhere beyond the veil that separated the living from the dead, Margaret Ashworth was indeed smiling upon them both with the satisfaction of a promise magnificently fulfilled. The weeks that followed their wedding unfolded like pages from a book Eleanor had never dared to read, each day revealing new chapters of happiness that she sometimes had to pinch herself to believe were truly hers. And as summer ripened into its fullest glory across the grounds of Ravenscroft Hall, she found herself transformed not only in title, but in the very essence of how she moved through the world, no longer the invisible widow whom society overlooked, but the Countess of Ravenscroft, a woman whose husband looked at her across crowded rooms with such undisguised adoration that even the most hardened gossips had begun to soften their whispers into something approaching admiration. Frederick himself had changed in ways that those who had known him during his dark years could scarcely comprehend. The bitter lines around his mouth smoothed by genuine smiles, the coldness in his blue eyes replaced by warmth that kindled whenever Eleanor entered his presence, and the servants who had once walked on eggshells around their volatile master now spoke of him with fond loyalty, for he had become the man his mother had always believed he could be, generous and just and capable of a tenderness that made Eleanor's heart ache with gratitude every time she witnessed it. They established new rhythms together in the ancient house, breakfast taken in the sunny morning room where Frederick would read aloud from the newspapers while Eleanor planned her charitable endeavors, for she had not abandoned her hospital work, but rather expanded it with her husband's enthusiastic support, funding a new wing that would bear the Dowager Countess's name and provide care for twice as many wounded soldiers as before. Afternoons often found them walking the extensive grounds hand in hand, Frederick sharing stories of his childhood that he had long buried beneath layers of grief and resentment, and Eleanor listening with the same compassionate attention she had once given his dying mother, understanding that in telling these tales he was reclaiming the happy memories that his years of bitterness had nearly erased. Evenings belonged to them alone, quiet hours in the library where they read together or talked of everything and nothing, and Eleanor discovered that the proud Earl who had once seemed so forbidding possessed a dry wit that made her laugh until tears streamed down her cheeks, and a capacity for philosophical discussion that challenged her mind in ways she had never experienced in her first marriage to the kind but simple merchant who had been more father than husband. When letters arrived from Bath bearing news that Lady Beatrice Montague had been caught in a scandal of her own making and had retreated to the country in disgrace, Eleanor felt no satisfaction in her former tormentor's downfall. Only a quiet recognition that cruelty eventually consumed those who practiced it, while kindness multiplied and returned in unexpected blessings. And on the morning when Eleanor woke feeling peculiarly unwell, and the physician was summoned, and the news was delivered that the Earl of Ravenscroft would have an heir by winter's end, Frederick wept openly as he gathered her in his arms, and Eleanor thought of the Dowager Countess, who had seen all of this somehow, who had known that a plain widow and a broken earl could save each other if only given the chance to try. The child came into the world on a bitter December night in 1815, and as Eleanor labored through the long, dark hours with Frederick refusing to leave her side, despite the scandalized protests of the midwife who insisted that husbands had no place in birthing chambers, she drew strength from his hand clasping hers, and his voice murmuring encouragements that she suspected he invented on the spot, because he had no more idea what to say than she had any notion of what to expect. And when at last the cry of new life pierced the candle-lit room, and the midwife placed a squalling, red-faced infant in Eleanor's exhausted arms, Frederick wept without shame as he beheld his daughter, for it was a girl with her mother's gentle brown eyes already visible beneath the newborn haze, and they named her Margaret, after the grandmother who would never hold her, but whose love had made her existence possible. In the years that followed, Ravenscroft Hall filled with sounds it had not known for decades, children's laughter echoing through corridors that had once rung only with bitter silence, for Margaret was joined by a brother named William, and then another daughter called Rose, and Eleanor watched her husband transform from the cold, proud earl who had once terrified servants and alienated friends into a father who crawled on nursery floors and told fantastical bedtime stories and carried sleeping children to their beds with a tenderness that made her heart overflow each time she witnessed it. The hospital in Bath continued to thrive under Eleanor's guidance even as her family grew, and she travelled there monthly to oversee operations and visit the soldiers who still called her the angel of the wards, though she always insisted she was merely a woman who had learned that purpose gave life meaning and that helping others healed wounds in oneself that one did not even know exist. Frederick often accompanied her on these visits, and the sight of the Earl of Ravenscroft sitting beside wounded men and listening to their stories became so commonplace that society eventually stopped remarking upon it, though Eleanor knew that each conversation was Frederick's way of honoring the mother whose compassion had once extended to everyone, and except the son who needed it most, a regret he channeled into action rather than allowing it to fester into further bitterness. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Frederick led Eleanor to the portrait gallery, where a new painting had been hung beside the Dowager Countess, and Eleanor gasped to see herself rendered in oils, not idealized or beautified, but captured exactly as she was, gentle brown eyes and unremarkable features, and the quiet dignity that the artist had somehow transformed into something luminous. And Frederick whispered that he had commissioned it so their children and grandchildren would always know the face of the woman who had saved him, the plain widow whom society had overlooked and whom he would spend every remaining day of his life ensuring felt cherished beyond measure. And Eleanor kissed him beneath the watching eyes of painted ancestors, and knew that promises made to dying women could indeed be kept magnificently.